was a house. In the house was a kitchen. In the kitchen was a cupboard, and between the cupboard and the floor was a crack. In the crack lived Mr. Murun Buchstansangur. Murun Buchstansangur loved dark, damp, dirty places, where bits of cat food and crisps collected. He loved filth and strong rotting smells. He also loved his next-door neighbour. Murun thought she was absolutely fantastic, but, unfortunately, she didn't think very much of him. In fact, she thought he was a bit odd and rather disgusting. So, to win her affection, Murun Buchstansangur spared no cost. He sent her enormous, very expensive bunches of flowers wrapped in cellophane. He sent her huge cards when it wasn't even her birthday. He had giant boxes of plain chocolates delivered to her. He had a chauffeur-driven limousine drive her to theatre opening nights in the West End. He even rang her up and asked her if she wasn't doing anything particular, would she like to join him for dinner, but she always said no. One day, he met her by the larder door. He suddenly realized that she wasn't anything special. So he smiled and said, "Hello," and wasn't it a cold day? She looked at him and realized he wasn't odd at all. In fact, he was rather nice. For the next few weeks, she tried everything to win his affection. She offered to clean his home. She offered to cook him Chinese meals. She even asked him if he knew if there were any good films on, as she hadn't been to the cinema for ages. But, unfortunately, for Murun Buchstansangur, the magic was gone forever. One day, Murun Buchstansangur was taking scrapings from the bottom of a dustbin when he overheard someone say, "You know that Murun Buchstansangur? He's the most revolting little creature I've ever met. You ought to see the place where he lives. It really is disgusting." Murun Buchstansangur was so upset he went to bed for a week. At the end of the week, he got up and looked in the mirror. "Murun," he said to himself. you can't really be as revolting and disgusting as all that. I'm sure somebody likes you." So Murun Buchstansangur went to the girl who lived next door and asked her if she thought he was revolting and disgusting. And she told him that if she really had to be honest, she thought he was, a bit. Then he rang up his cousin Rossiter and asked him, "By the way, do you think I'm smelly, revolting and disgusting?" "Well," said his cousin Rossiter, "now you mention it, I suppose you are." Murun Buchstansangur walked away, feeling very depressed. He met a passing spider and asked him, "Would you say I was the most revolting, smelly, disgusting and awful creature you have ever seen?" But the spider didn't even stop to answer. Murun Buchstansangur went home. Just before going to bed, Murun looked in the mirror again and thought to himself, "Murun, you'll just have to clean yourself up, clear out all your bits and pieces, and from now on keep you and your home continually washed and tidy. Otherwise, everybody will always think you are revolting and disgusting, and no one will like you." And then he thought, "But what does it matter?" One evening, Murun Buchstansangur was settling down in his bed when a great big beetle came into his home, uninvited. At first, Murun was speechless. When he'd regained his composure, he went up to the beetle and said, "Out!" But the beetle stayed. So, Murun Buchstansangur decided to take a harder line. He found a stick, and he prodded the beetle and said, "Get out, beetle, I want to go to bed." But the beetle didn't move. Then Murun thought perhaps he would try to reason with the creature and gently coax him out. So he patted the beetle on the back and said, "Come on, old chap, out you go." But the beetle stayed where he was. Murun Buchstansangur was feeling rather tired of the whole business. So he decided he would go to bed and hope that the beetle would leave by himself. In the morning, Murun found that the beetle was still where he had left him. By now, he had run out of ideas on how to tackle the problem. So, he put a rag over the beetle's back and used the new surface to put his bits and pieces on. One evening, a few days later, the beetle left. Murun Buchstansangur went to the place where the beetle had been and thought how useful that new surface had proved. So, he found an old tin, covered it with a rag, and used that to put his bits and pieces on. But, somehow, it wasn't the same. Isn't it strange, thought Murun to himself that night, how quickly you grow used to having someone around. It was a spring morning, and Murun Buchstansangur got up early to organise his bits and pieces in the crack where he lived. Just as he was sitting back, admiring his work, his next-door neighbour came in. Murun Buchstansangur, this crack of yours is a disgrace. It's filthy and it smells. You must let me completely redecorate it for you. Would you like that? She said. Well, I suppose so, said Murun. I'll clear out all this mess and put all the rubbish in a black plastic bin liner. I'll buy some wallpaper and paint. I'll make it lovely in here. You won't recognize it. Won't I? Said Murun. The next day, Murun Buchstansangur's neighbour came round. Look, she said, I've got some beautiful wallpaper and matching curtains. I've got some rush matting for the floor and a big round paper lampshade. What do you think? Very nice, said Murun, and he went out for a long walk. When he came back, his next-door neighbour had finished. "There you are," she said. "That's much better, isn't it?" "Yes," said Murun. The following day, Murun Buchstansangur's neighbour came round again. She was shocked. "Oh! Look what you've done. You ruined the wallpaper. You've got mess all over the floor. The place is disgusting." "Murun Buchstansangur, you're absolutely impossible." Quite true, he thought. Murun Buchstansangur had been fond of the girl who lived next door for quite a long time. Consequently, he wasn't very pleased when she came round to introduce her new boyfriend, Nigel Clark, with an E. "Nigel's got a new red sports car with a soft top," she said. "Has he?" said Murun. "We're going to drive into town and have an Indian meal at that place in the High Street." "Really?" said Murun. "Good night." "See you around," said Nigel. "I hope you choke on your papadum, Nigel Clark with an E," said Murun to himself. During the evening, Murun Buchstansangur couldn't seem to settle to anything. The more he thought of his next-door neighbour and Nigel Clark, the more restless and depressed he became. Finally, he decided to go for a walk in the High Street. When he returned, Murun Buchstansangur felt much better. A little later, Murun's neighbour came round. "Did you have a nice evening?" asked Murun. "No, I did not," she replied. "The police came and towed Nigel's sports car away. Apparently, the owner of the building he had parked outside in the high street rang up the police, saying the car was obstructing the entrance. "Really?" said Murun. "Yes," she said. Nigel had to go down to the police station to pick it up. "I was so cross, I walked home on my own." "Never mind," said Murun. "Come in and have a drink of something." Murun Buchstansangur had a cousin called Rossiter. Rossiter had written to say that he was coming down for a visit. Murun thought he'd better tidy up a bit before Rossiter arrived. Rossiter had been down a few times before. He was one of those people who was full of exciting stories. He'd been to the USA and Japan. He'd travelled across Europe. He'd met lots and lots of very interesting people. He could talk at length and in great detail on every subject Murun could think of. But did Murun Buchstansangur enjoy his company? Did he look forward to the coming visit? No, he did not. For Murun Buchstansangur found his cousin Rossiter terribly, terribly dull. "Come in, Rossiter," said Murun. Rossiter came in and sat down. Murun went to make something to eat, and Rossiter started talking. Murun never told him about the things he'd been doing, as Rossiter wasn't really very interested. Rossiter only liked to talk about himself. As the evening wore on, Murun found that he was asking Rossiter the time more and more frequently. Finally, Murun stood up. "Time for you to go, Rossiter," he said, and he ushered Rossiter out into the night. As he settled down in his bed, Murun Buchstansangur thought to himself, "Look at me. I've never been to the USA or Japan. I've never travelled across Europe. I don't know lots and lots of interesting people. Perhaps it's me who's boring." Then he looked back over his evening with Cousin Rossiter and thought, "But perhaps it's not." One Sunday morning, Murun Buchstansangur was looking everywhere for a small piece of navy blue raincoat lining, which he'd had since he was very young. It had a particular smell that he liked. He scraped about for hours, but couldn't find it anywhere, and he got very fed up. Later that evening, his next-door neighbour came to see him. She told him that her mother was very ill in hospital and that her hamster had died. "And yesterday morning," she said, "I saw my boyfriend in the high street, and he was holding hands with another girl." Then she burst into tears. Murun put his arm round her shoulder and kissed her. For the rest of the week, Murun Buchstansangur spent the days pacing up and down. He was very depressed. At night, he couldn't sleep. He lay awake and thought to himself, "Oh, she must be so lonely. No mother, no hamster, and no boyfriend. Terrible. And to cap it all, I can't find my blasted piece of navy blue raincoat lining." At the end of the week, his next-door neighbour came round again. She said, "My mother's much better. She comes out of hospital tomorrow. And this morning, my boyfriend came over to see me. He brought a present, a baby hamster in a cage." She was so happy, Murun Buchstansangur put his arm over her shoulder and kissed her. But he still felt depressed. He thought, why is it that however bad other people's problems are, they never seem quite as bad as one's own? I still can't find that damn piece of navy blue raincoat lining. very popular band was playing for one night only up at the Polytechnic. Nigel Clark had tickets. "They're all sold out," he told Murun Buchstansangur. "I managed to get these through a friend." "You're an absolute wizard, Nigel," said Murun. Murun didn't want tickets anyway. He was going to see a film that night with his next-door neighbour. While he was getting ready to pick her up, there was a phone call. It was his next-door neighbour. She said that she wanted to come to the film with him, but she had a bad cold, and she really didn't feel well enough to go out. A little later, as he was passing the window, Murun noticed Nigel Clark's car stop outside his neighbour's house. "I suppose they're going to the concert," thought Murun to himself. The following evening, Murun's neighbour came round to see him. "Hello, Murun," she said. "Hello," said Murun. She told him that she was so disappointed that she hadn't gone to the film, but she really hadn't been well enough. "I saw Nigel picking you up last night," said Murun. "Oh," she said. She looked at him and added, "Murun, I'm sorry." "That's all right," said Murun. "Do you forgive me?" "Yes," said Murun. She flung her arms around him and kissed him. That night, Murun reflected. It's quite easy, really, to forgive, but, unfortunately, it's impossible to forget. Very occasionally, Murun Buchstansangur would wake up in the morning with a terrible migraine. It would always begin as a dull ache, which would gradually get worse, until it became a severe pain just above his eyebrow. He would start to see blotches before his eyes, and he felt sick. Nothing he could do would get rid of it. So he stayed in bed, left the curtains closed, put out the light, and hoped that it would go away. Murun was lying in bed with the light out on an occasion like this, when there was a knock at the door. Murun had had an appalling migraine all day, and the thought of having to spend the evening entertaining visitors was awful. His head felt as though a man in a hard hat was trying to bore his way out with a hammer drill. Murun went to open the door. The merrymakers trooped in. Murun sat quietly while everyone chatted. Nigel Clark thought Murun was feeling left out, so he tried to bring him into the conversation. Murun hated being brought into conversations. He stood up. "I'm afraid I haven't anything to offer you all, so why don't we go to that little pub out in the country? It's rather hard to find. You take the 43 bus out of town, get off where it crosses the motorway, and follow the little lane to Patching for about 1.5 miles. The pub's on the right. You can't miss it. I have to get ready, so I'll meet you there." When his visitors had left, Murun thought perhaps in his condition he had better not go out after all. So he went back to bed. "Now I come to think of it," thought Murun to himself, "I'm not absolutely sure that pub really exists." But his head hurt so much it didn't seem important. One evening, Murun Buchstansangur was busy in his back room when there was a knock at his entrance. "Why is it that people always decide to call at the most inconvenient moments?" said Murun to himself. "Who's this then?" It was his next-door neighbour. She had been fond of Murun for a very long time, and Murun liked her. "Oh, hello," said Murun. "I saw your light was on, so I thought I'd just drop by," she said. "Oh," said Murun. "Well, it's very nice to see you." "I'm not disturbing you, am I?" she said. "Oh no, not a bit." "Are you sure?" "Yes, quite sure." "Well, you don't seem very pleased to see me," she said. "Oh, of course I'm pleased to see you," said Murun. "Look, would you like to come in and have some coffee?" "Well, if you're sure you're not busy." "I'll just go and tidy up a bit first," said Murun. "I won't be long." "Oh, don't bother to tidy up for me," she said. "I'm used to your place being in a mess." "Well, it's particularly messy today." "Oh, Murun, I don't mind." "No, really, it's in a terrible state," said Murun. "I know how you hate a mess." "If you don't want me to come in, Murun, just say so." "Of course I want you to come in." "I won't stay long." "No, please," said Murun. "Stay as long as you like." "All right, Murun," she said. "Just let me tidy up a bit first," said Murun. "Oh, Murun, I'm going home." "Can I come and see you tomorrow?" said Murun. "I don't know." "Oh, I suppose so," said his next-door neighbour, and she left. "You know what you are, Murun Buchstansangur," he thought to himself. "You're wicked." Murun Buchstansangur was stacking up a collection of old peanuts which had fallen into the crack where he lived, and he was feeling quite tired when he had an unexpected visit from his cousin Rossiter. "Hello, Rossiter," said Murun. "I've come down to visit my mother, so I thought I'd drop in to see you on the way," said Rossiter. "Oh," said Murun, who didn't like to be disturbed, especially by a boring old cousin Rossiter. Rossiter would always insist on talking at length about the exciting things he'd done and the interesting people he knew. "I can't face an evening of listening to Rossiter," thought Murun. This calls for something drastic. "I want you to try some of this homemade wine, Rossiter," said Murun. "This isn't homemade," said Rossiter. "It says Runsford Wines on the label." "It was made by residents of Runsford Old People's Home," said Murun. "I won it in a raffle. Drink up." After Rossiter had had a few glasses of wine, he became a bit sad and said, "Everybody thinks I do exciting things and that I know a lot of very interesting people. But actually, I don't have any real friends, and my life isn't exciting at all. I think you'd better go home now, Rossiter," said Murun. "Do you mind if I stay the night?" asked Rossiter. "I'm too drunk to drive home." "That's all right, I'll call a taxi," said Murun. The taxi soon arrived, and Murun watched Rossiter go. When Murun was tucked up in his warm bed, he thought about his evening with Rossiter. "I hope I wasn't too hard on him," he thought to himself. "No, I could have made him walk home." Murun Buchstansangur's next-door neighbour had gone for 2 weeks' holiday in Miami with a friend. Murun had missed her and was looking forward to seeing her again. He decided he would give a special welcome on her return. He would invite her to dinner. First, he cleaned and tidied his home. Then he laid the table. Then he prepared the most fantastic meal he could think of. When everything was ready, Murun sat down and waited. And he waited. And he waited. And he waited. What can have happened to her? He thought. Finally, Murun couldn't wait any more. So he went to telephone the airline. He was told that the flight from Miami was delayed for 24 hours due to a strike by air traffic controllers. It's strange, thought Murun Buchstansangur to himself. The more you look forward to something, the more likely you are to be disappointed. very long time, Murun Buchstansangur had been convinced that his eyes were too close together. He'd often looked in the mirror from every conceivable angle. He'd taken a ruler and measured the gap between his eyes. He'd tried to cover parts of his face with his hand, wondering if, somehow, his other features were causing the trouble. But he didn't really think there was any doubt about it. His eyes were far too close together. In order to solve the problem, Murun Buchstansangur had tried wearing wide-brimmed hats to hide his eyes. He had practiced raising his eyebrows in case that would help. He'd even made a prototype pair of spectacles from bent wire to see if these would give the impression that his eyes were further apart than they really were. But he didn't think they did. Some days, Murun was so acutely conscious of his eyes, he was too embarrassed to leave the house. He just sat and moped. Finally, Murun looked at himself in the mirror and said, "Murun Buchstansangur, you can't go on like this. Your eyes probably aren't that close together. And even if they were," he thought, "I'm sure nobody has ever noticed." That evening, Murun Buchstansangur's next-door neighbour came round to cut his hair. "How do you want it?" she asked. Perhaps a fringe," he said. "Oh no, Murun," she said. "A fringe wouldn't suit you. Your eyes are far too close together."